The Fairmont townhouse on Grosvenor Square stood in quiet dignity as dusk descended upon London. Its facade, with tall windows and stately columns, reflected the orange hue of the setting sun. Within its drawing rooms, however, the atmosphere was far from still. Servants hurried along the corridors, carrying gowns, fans, and boxes of pearls. The Fairmont family was preparing for the most anticipated event of the season, the Marlborough Ball. For Lady Juliette, the eldest daughter, the evening promised more than an evening of dancing. It was the night she had been waiting for, the night her parents believed would change her destiny. At 21, Juliette carried herself with the grace expected of a viscount's daughter. Years of careful instruction had prepared her for this very stage. Tutors had honed her French and Italian, music masters had shaped her touch upon the pianoforte, and dance instructors had trained her steps until they seemed as natural as breathing. Her beauty was often praised in the parlours of London, hair dark as polished ebony, skin fair and luminous, and eyes of a blue that mirrored the midsummer sky. Yet it was not her beauty alone that drew admiration. She possessed a softness of manner, a warmth that lent sincerity to every smile and made her presence difficult to ignore. Her mother, the Viscountess Fairmont, supervised the final preparations with relentless attention. She adjusted the folds of Juliette's gown, a creation of pale blue silk embroidered with delicate silver threads. The bodice, fitted and elegant, displayed the fine craftsmanship that only the best modistes of Bond Street could provide. Pearls rested upon Juliette's neck, their luster chosen to echo the modest purity expected of a young woman of her station. Her hair was arranged with care, powdered only lightly, allowing its natural shade to shine through, crowned by a small spray of white blossoms. "You look every inch the Duchess you are meant to be," her mother said, her voice firm, more command than compliment. She glanced toward the mirror, ensuring her daughter absorbed the weight of those words. Juliette lowered her gaze, her heart fluttering beneath the silken fabric. To be called Duchess was not merely a dream, it was the goal her family had set before her. The Duke of Ravenscroft was said to have noticed her in previous assemblies, and tonight, before the eyes of London's most illustrious families, he was expected to make his intentions clear. The Viscount himself appeared at the doorway, his presence more reserved but no less imposing. He observed his daughter silently for a moment, then gave a single approving nod. He knew the value of this night. To see his daughter raised to the rank of Duchess would not only secure her future, but elevate the family's standing for generations. Behind his calm exterior, he carried the weight of expectation. Juliette felt it keenly, though she did not speak of it. Instead, she pressed her gloved hands together to steady their trembling. The carriage ride to the Marlborough residence passed in a blur of anticipation. The city's streets were alive with movement. Lanterns glimmered along the cobblestones, carriages rattled past, and the sound of hooves echoed against the stone facades of townhouses. Inside the Fairmont carriage, the silence was taut, broken only by her mother's brief instructions on posture and composure. Juliette kept her eyes fixed upon the passing lamps, their light flickering across her pale features. She could not deny the swell of excitement rising within her chest. To dance with the Duke, to hear him speak, to feel the acknowledgement of the crowd. It was all she had envisioned in her quiet moments of longing. When they arrived, the Marlborough mansion glittered with light. Torches burned brightly along the grand entrance, while the sound of violins drifted from within. A stream of carriages deposited lords and ladies clad in satin, brocade and jewels. Juliette descended from her carriage, her gloved hand resting lightly upon her father's arm. The grandeur of the evening pressed upon her senses. The crush of gowns, the perfume mingling with candle wax, the gleam of diamonds against silk. Inside, the ballroom unfolded like a vision. Chandeliers, heavy with crystal, spilled their radiance across gilded ceilings. The polished floor reflected the twirling dancers, and the air hummed with conversation, laughter, and the steady rhythm of the musicians. Footmen moved with precision, offering wine and ices upon silver trays. The very height of London society had gathered, Each face turned toward the other in a dance of ambition and rivalry. Juliette stepped into this sea of light with an elegance that belied the storm within her. She was keenly aware of the eyes that followed her entrance, measuring her, weighing her worth. Yet she carried herself with calm, her chin lifted, her smile composed. She had learned long ago that the smallest falter could spark whispers, and whispers could ignite into scandal. Tonight, there must be no misstep. As she moved among the guests, exchanging greetings and curtsies, her thoughts circled around a single figure, the Duke of Ravenscroft. He was the subject of endless talk in drawing rooms across London. His wealth, his lineage, his influence in Parliament, these were matters well known. But it was his presence that commanded fascination. Some called him aloof, others proud, yet all agreed that his gaze could unsettle even the most assured of women. Juliette had glimpsed him only briefly in past assemblies. Tall, broad-shouldered, carrying the quiet authority of one accustomed to command. His hair, dark though powdered in the current fashion, framed a face of striking severity. His eyes, grey as tempered steel, revealed little of his thoughts. Whispers spoke of a heart marked by some private sorrow, though none dared speak of it openly. To Juliette he had seemed distant, as though observing the world from behind an invisible barrier. Yet tonight, she believed that barrier might finally break. As the evening progressed, she danced with several partners, each carefully chosen by her mother to display her poise and charm. Lords complimented her gown, ladies assessed her with sharp eyes, and Juliette responded with all the composure she could summon. Still, she found herself glancing toward the entrance, her heart tightening with every passing moment of anticipation. The crowd seemed to shift, restless with expectation, as though sensing the imminent arrival of the evening's most awaited guest. Then, at last, the Duke appeared. The room seemed to inhale as he crossed the threshold. Conversation faltered, fans stilled, and even the music seemed to soften in his presence. He was dressed in dark velvet, his figure tall and commanding, his expression grave. He moved with deliberate steps, each one sending ripples through the crowd. Nobles parted to allow his passage, their eyes fixed upon him with reverence or envy. Juliette's breath caught. His gaze swept the room, steady and searching, until it found her. For an instant, her world seemed to narrow to that single look. Her pulse quickened, her skin warmed beneath her gown, and she felt the weight of every whispered expectation pressing upon her. She curtsied as he approached, her movements graceful, her heart hammering with unspoken hope. The Duke bowed with precision, his eyes locked upon hers. The room hushed, the crowd watching with unblinking curiosity. This was the moment, the culmination of whispers, of dreams, of her family's aspirations. In that charged silence, Juliette believed she stood on the threshold of a future crowned with triumph. But as he straightened, the Duke's face remained unreadable. His lips pressed together, his expression cold, as though carved from stone. The hush deepened, expectant, breathless. The crowd leaned in, eager to witness what words would pass from his mouth. The music faded, and as silence fell over the assembly, the Duke prepared to speak words that would strike Juliette to the core. The hush inside the Marlborough ballroom grew so profound that the faint crackle of candle flames could be heard above the stillness. Hundreds of eyes fixed themselves upon the tall figure of the Duke of Ravenscroft. He stood before Lady Juliette, his gloved hand resting briefly against the hilt of his sword, his posture immaculate, his gaze unyielding. Juliette, her breath caught between hope and dread, waited with the entire room for his words. When he spoke, his voice was steady, clear, and without hesitation. "Lady Juliette," he declared, each syllable carrying to the farthest corners of the hall, "you will never be my wife." The sentence fell with the weight of a hammer, unbroken and final. A ripple passed through the crowd, gasps and whispers colliding in a wave of disbelief. Fans snapped open, men muttered to one another, and heads turned to capture every detail of the scandal unfolding in their midst. Juliette stood rooted to the polished floor, Her lips parted, but no words emerged. The air seemed to abandon her lungs, and the glittering chandeliers above blurred in her vision. In the space of a single sentence, every dream she had carefully nurtured, every assurance whispered by her family, and every hope of triumph collapsed into dust. The silence that followed was not empty. It throbbed with curiosity, shock, and the sharpened edge of mockery. The Duke did not falter. His gray eyes remained fixed upon her, unreadable, as though he had severed her from his future without the slightest tremor. After bowing with formality, he turned from her and walked into the crowd, leaving behind a stunned young woman and the murmur of scandal blooming in his wake. His tall figure disappeared among the throng of nobility, who parted to grant him passage, but immediately closed ranks to whisper behind raised hands. Juliette's skin burned as though set aflame. She could feel the weight of countless stares upon her shoulders, each one dissecting her humiliation. Snatches of gossip reached her ears, carried on the breath of those too enthralled to lower their voices. "So public, so cruel. Did you see her face?" whispered one lady, her voice laced with delight. Another murmured, "He could have chosen discretion, yet he struck her before us all." Laughter, muffled though it was, echoed from some corners, twisting like a knife into her pride. Her mother's fan clattered against the floor, quickly retrieved by a servant, but the moment revealed even the Viscountess's composure had faltered. The Viscount's jaw tightened, his expression locked in iron restraint, though his hand twitched at his side. Around them, the tide of gossip rose higher, drowning out the music entirely. The musicians faltered, bows trembling against strings, until silence conquered even the instruments meant to veil the scandal. Juliette forced herself to breathe. Her knees threatened to give way beneath the weight of humiliation, yet she would not collapse. Not here, not in front of those who relished her downfall. Her gloved fingers curled tightly at her sides, her nails pressing into her palms as she summoned every fragment of strength within her. She raised her chin, her face pale but her expression composed, and turned toward the nearest exit. The crowd parted reluctantly, as though savoring her retreat. Murmurs pursued her with each step. A gentleman whispered, "The poor creature," though his tone lacked sympathy, savoring the spectacle instead. A lady tittered behind her fan, her eyes glinting with envy, disguised as pity. Every footfall seemed to echo louder, the polished floor reflecting not only her image but also her shame. She did not dare glance back at the Duke, for she knew his figure would be surrounded by a host of onlookers eager to unravel the reason for his merciless rejection. At the edge of the ballroom, her father reached her side, offering his arm. His expression betrayed nothing, though his grip upon her hand was firm, guiding her with silent urgency. Her mother followed closely, her fan pressed tightly against her lips to conceal the tremor of her mouth. Together, they crossed the antechamber, the glitter of the chandeliers fading behind them as the murmurs of the crowd grew fainter, though not less cruel. Outside, the night air struck Juliette's cheeks with biting clarity. The Fairmont carriage awaited at the foot of the steps, its lanterns glowing faintly in the dark. The family descended swiftly, ignoring the clusters of onlookers who had spilled into the street, eager to catch the aftermath of the scene. Juliette's head remained high, though tears threatened to break through the surface of her composure. She entered the carriage first, sinking against the cushions as though the fabric alone could shield her from the memory of the ballroom. Her father joined, his silence heavy with unspoken rage, while her mother's face was pale beneath her powdered hair. The carriage door closed, and the vehicle lurched forward, its wheels rattling over the cobblestones. Yet even within the confined space, the echoes of gossip clung to them, as if the whispers had followed into the dark. Juliette pressed her gloves against her lips, struggling to steady her breath. The image of the Duke's face, cold, resolute, unflinching, seared itself into her mind. His words reverberated with cruel clarity. Never, never her wife. The repetition beat against her thoughts, drowning all else. She recalled the anticipation that had lit her heart only moments before, the hope that had lifted her steps as she entered the hall, and the brutal swiftness with which it had been crushed. Her mother finally broke the silence, her voice strained, low but edged with sharpness. "We must not be seen again until this matter is managed. The Marlboroughs will have already spread the tale. Every household in London will know by dawn." The Viscount gave no reply, his gaze fixed on the dark street beyond the window. His jaw clenched in silence. Juliette could not answer either. To speak would be to shatter what little remained of her composure. The carriage rattled on, its lanterns casting fleeting shadows against the high walls of Mayfair houses. Juliette leaned her head against the seat back, her vision blurred by unshed tears. Her gloves, once symbols of elegance, now felt like shackles pressing against trembling hands. Each jolt of the carriage brought with it a fresh wave of despair, as though the very motion carried her further from the life she had believed awaited her. When the carriage finally turned into Grosvenor Square, the sight of her home did not bring comfort. Instead, it stood like a witness to her shame, the tall windows reflecting the faint moonlight, as if recording her return in disgrace. Servants hurried forward with lanterns, their eyes lowered yet flickering with curiosity. They had heard or would soon hear of what had transpired. The humiliation had not ended within the ballroom. It would haunt every corridor, every parlor, every whisper exchanged beneath her own roof. Juliette allowed herself to be led inside. The familiar hallway stretched before her, its polished floors and portraits now suffocating reminders of the expectations she had carried. Her feet felt heavy, her gown a burden of silk that mocked her with its beauty. She could hear her sisters stirring upstairs, perhaps awakened by the noise of the carriage, perhaps waiting to question her triumph. Their excitement would soon turn to shock when the truth emerged. She ascended the staircase slowly, each step echoing louder in the silence of the house. At the top, she paused, clutching the banister to steady herself. The weight of her family's future, the loss of her own dignity, and the crushing certainty of gossip pressed upon her with unbearable force. For the first time that evening, her composure faltered. Tears welled in her eyes, slipping down her cheeks, despite her desperate attempt to hold them back. Behind her, her mother's voice reached her in a whisper meant only for her ears. "We shall endure this, Juliette. But you must be strong. Tomorrow, you will face the world again." Juliette did not answer. She gathered her skirts and turned toward her chamber, her tears falling silently onto the silk. She longed only for solitude, for the safety of her room, where she might collapse without the gaze of society upon her. The door closed behind her with a dull thud, shutting out the murmurs of her parents below. Alone in the darkness of her chamber, she removed her gloves with trembling fingers and pressed her face into them, muffling her sobs. The candles upon her dressing table flickered weakly, casting shadows across the room. The humiliation, the whispers, the merciless gaze of the crowd, all pressed upon her like a nightmare that refused to dissolve. By the time she rose and crossed the room to close the curtains, her tears had soaked through the fine fabric of her gloves. She leaned against the window, her forehead resting upon the cool glass, staring into the dark square below. The sound of laughter still echoed in her ears, though it came only from memory. The night stretched before her, merciless and unending. She knew that dawn would not bring peace but the cruel certainty of gossip spreading across London. Every parlor, every breakfast table, every gathering would carry her humiliation as its subject. The weight of that knowledge pressed against her chest until she could scarcely breathe. And as she stood in the silence of her chamber, her cheeks wet with tears, the door creaked softly behind her, and someone stepped into the room. The faint creak of the door drew Juliette from her daze by the window. Her breath caught as she turned, half expecting her mother's stern figure or her father's measured reproach. But no one entered at once. The candlelight flickered against the polished wood as the door eased open further, spilling a shaft of dim light from the corridor into her chamber. Her heart pounded. The evening's humiliation still clung to her skin like a shroud, and she had prayed for solitude. Instead, the silence of her room fractured, and the awareness that she was no longer alone pressed down on her. She clutched the folds of her gown at her waist, her tears still fresh upon her cheeks, unsure if she wished to face anyone, even family. A servant's discreet shadow passed in the hall, but no one entered. The door settled slightly ajar, leaving Juliette staring at it in tense anticipation. For a long moment she did not move, only listened to the faint crackle of her candles. The house around her carried restless sounds, the muffled rise of voices in her parents' chamber, the creak of a floorboard as someone hurried along the gallery, the rustle of skirts as maids whispered beyond her door. She sank into the chair at her dressing table, her gloves still damp from the tears she had buried in them. The sight of her own reflection undid her composure once more. Her face was pale, her eyes red-rimmed, and the carefully powdered curls that framed her forehead now hung limp from the heat of her tears. She hardly resembled the young woman who had stepped so hopefully into the Marlborough ballroom hours earlier. Her humiliation had been complete. The words of the Duke, words that had resounded in cruel clarity through the chandeliered hall, still echoed mercilessly in her ears. He had not only rejected her, he had condemned her before the very eyes of society. That sentence, "You will never be my wife," had stripped her of dignity in a single instant. She could almost still feel the sting of whispered laughter and the weight of countless eyes. Juliette pressed her hands against her face, wishing she could hide from the memory. Her sobs returned, unrestrained now in the privacy of her room. The sound filled the chamber, a contrast to the brittle silence she had maintained through the journey home. She curled against the edge of her chair, her silk gown creasing beneath her, and allowed despair to overwhelm her. Beyond her door, the house remained unsettled. She could hear her parents' voices rise and fall in agitated tones. Though she could not make out their words, she knew the subject of their discussion was her disgrace. The Viscount would measure the damage to the family's reputation, calculating what alliances had been lost. The Viscountess would speak in sharp, quick sentences, already planning how to repair the ruin. Neither would ask how Juliette's heart had borne the blow. The servants, too, would not be silent. Already she imagined the maids whispering in the kitchens, the footmen exchanging knowing glances as they tended to the household's needs. They would carry the tale to neighbors, to market stalls, to anyone who would listen. By morning, her humiliation would not belong only to the nobility, but to every voice in London willing to repeat the story. She rose suddenly, her steps unsteady, and crossed the room to the window once more. She tore the curtains closed, shutting out the moonlight and the sight of Grosvenor Square below. Yet even with the heavy fabric drawn, the night did not protect her. Shadows pressed against her, and the silence of the chamber seemed to echo with voices of ridicule. Juliette staggered back to the edge of her bed, collapsing upon its embroidered coverlet. The lace of her sleeves tangled as she buried her face in the pillows, muffling her sobs. Her shoulders shook with the force of her grief. She felt imprisoned, not only by walls but by the memory of hundreds of eyes and the endless chain of whispers they would unleash. Her younger sisters, who had once admired every ribbon and gown she wore, did not come to her. She had heard their footsteps earlier in the evening, their hushed questions floating through the corridors. But now the silence of their absence spoke more loudly than words. They were too frightened, too uncertain of how to approach a sister who had fallen from promise into disgrace. Even within her own home, she was isolated. The hours passed slowly. The candles upon her dressing table burned lower, dripping wax onto the silver holders. The air grew heavy with the scent of extinguished flames as one candle sputtered out. Juliette did not move, curled against the pillows, her gown wrinkled, her pearls pressing uncomfortably into her skin. She felt the night stretch endlessly before her, a torment without release. Images of the ballroom returned with merciless clarity. She saw again the Duke's face, so cold, so unrelenting. She heard the gasps of the crowd, the snap of fans, the music faltering into silence, and always the words repeated, as if etched into her soul. Never. Never. She tried to push the memory away, but it clung to her with cruel persistence. Her tears finally ebbed into quiet sobs. She lay still, staring at the canopy above her bed, the embroidered patterns blurred by swollen eyes. Fatigue pulled at her, though her mind would not rest. She was trapped between despair and exhaustion, her body weak, yet her spirit restless with grief. Outside her chamber, the corridor fell silent. Her parents' voices no longer reached her. The servants' footsteps ceased. The household, it seemed, had surrendered to sleep at last, though sleep offered Juliette no refuge. She felt more alone than she had ever known. She closed her eyes, hoping for even a moment's escape. But just as she drifted near the edge of rest, the faint sound of the door creaking returned. This time, the sound was deliberate, closer, undeniable. She sat upright in her bed, her breath caught in her throat, as the latch turned slowly, and the door began to open. The door opened fully now, and the figure that entered was not her mother's stern silhouette, nor her father's rigid frame, but her aunt, Lady Eleanor. She moved with quiet purpose, closing the door behind her with deliberate care. The candlelight caught the silver of her hair beneath a simple lace cap, and the lines on her face spoke of years lived with both sorrow and endurance. Juliette, still seated upright on her bed, drew her shawl closer around her shoulders. Her breath trembled, but she did not speak. She had braced herself for reproach, for the sharp reminders of duty her parents so often delivered. But instead, her aunt's eyes carried something else entirely. Not pity, not judgment. Something steadier, stronger. Lady Eleanor crossed the chamber slowly, her step unhurried, as though she wished to grant Juliette time to gather herself. She did not glance at the pearls discarded on the floor or the rumpled silk of her gown. She looked only at Juliette, with a gaze that held neither surprise nor dismay. At last, she settled into the chair near the bed, folding her hands lightly in her lap. For a time, the chamber was filled only with the faint crackle of the last candle burning low upon the dressing table. Juliette lowered her eyes, ashamed of her swollen cheeks and the redness around her eyes. But Lady Eleanor's calm presence eased the sting of her humiliation. Here was someone who had not seen her stumble in the ballroom, who had not listened to the cruel whispers in the carriage, who had not measured her against the family's expectations. When Lady Eleanor finally spoke, her voice was gentle but firm, each word carrying a weight shaped by experience. She reminded Juliette that dignity could not be taken by others, that it lived within, even when stripped of outward triumphs. She confessed that she herself had once stood where Juliette now stood, at the mercy of a husband chosen not for love, but for duty, a union that had suffocated her spirit until widowhood granted her release. Her sorrow had not destroyed her. Instead, it had hardened her resolve. Juliette listened in silence. She had never heard her aunt speak so openly of her past. The household often treated Lady Eleanor with a mixture of respect and pity, regarding her as a relic of faded fortune. Yet now, in the quiet of the chamber, Juliette saw her differently, not as a figure of defeat, but as one who had endured and emerged stronger. Her aunt's words pierced through the fog of despair. They did not erase the sting of humiliation, nor the ache of betrayal, but they offered something Juliette had not known since the ballroom, a spark of steadiness. For the first time since the Duke's declaration, she felt the faint stir of defiance. She was not only a victim of cruelty, she was not only a subject of ridicule, she still had within her the power to shape how she would endure. Lady Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes unwavering. She spoke of silence as a weapon, of composure as armor, of resilience as the truest rebellion against a society eager to watch a woman crumble. And then, with deliberate care, she suggested what Juliette had not yet dared imagine, that she might leave London for a time, retreat with her to the countryside where scandal's reach would be fainter. There, away from the glitter and the whispers, she could breathe again. Juliette's heart thudded with uncertainty. To leave meant admitting defeat, yet to stay meant enduring the unrelenting gaze of a city that thrived on scandal. The thought of escape brought a strange relief, though it frightened her too. Still, As she looked into her aunt's steady face, she felt a glimmer of hope flicker through the ashes of her despair. The chamber grew still once more. The last candle sputtered, throwing long shadows across the walls. Juliette drew in a breath, her hands loosening their desperate grip on the shawl. She did not yet know what path she would choose, but she knew she was no longer entirely alone. And then, before Juliette could speak, a knock sounded sharply against the door, breaking the fragile quiet of the moment. The knock echoed through the chamber, abrupt and insistent, startling Juliette where she sat upon the bed. Lady Eleanor turned her head, her expression calm, though her eyes sharpened with the awareness that the household had not yet surrendered to rest. The sound carried clearly through the silence of the night, each rap against the wood unsettling the fragile steadiness that had begun to settle over Juliette's heart. Lady Eleanor rose, smoothing her dark gown, and crossed to the door. She did not open it at once, but waited, her hand poised upon the latch. The knock came again, softer now, as though urgency had given way to hesitation. When the door finally parted, Juliette glimpsed the outline of a servant in the corridor, holding a sealed letter upon a tray. With a low bow, the man explained that the message had arrived moments earlier, delivered by hand. Eleanor accepted it with measured composure, her eyes narrowing slightly as she noted the seal. She dismissed the servant, then returned to Juliette, setting the letter upon the small writing desk by the window. The wax bore the crest of her father's household, the Fairmont insignia impressed deeply into the red. Juliette's hands trembled as she reached for it, uncertain of what further blow might await her in written words. She broke the seal carefully, the crack of wax echoing faintly in the chamber. The script within was unmistakably her father's, firm, deliberate strokes, each line precise. Juliette's eyes moved across the words, her breath quickening as the message unfolded. Her father informed her that a gentleman, Lord Pembroke, had already expressed interest in her hand. He was respectable, steady, and willing to overlook the unfortunate events of the ball. Her father urged her to receive him, to consider his proposal, and to view this as an opportunity to repair what had been lost. The letter trembled in her grasp. Juliette felt her heart sink with a heaviness different from the pain of the ballroom. This was not the sharp sting of humiliation, but the slow weight of resignation pressing upon her. Her father's words carried not the comfort of protection, but the command of duty. She knew what such encouragement meant: to secure the family's reputation, to silence gossip, to bury her disgrace beneath the respectable name of another. Lady Eleanor watched her silently, her hands folded at her waist. She did not intrude upon Juliette's reading, nor did she voice her opinion. Instead, she stood as a pillar, allowing her niece to absorb the meaning of the letter on her own. Juliette's breath came unevenly. She read the words again, though their meaning had already burned itself into her mind. The image of Lord Pembroke arose faintly from her memory. His polite bow at past assemblies, his measured compliments, his eyes that carried duty but little warmth. Juliette lowered the letter to her lap, her hands trembling. She felt the pull of two forces within her, the duty that had always guided her steps and the faint spark of defiance her aunt had kindled. To accept would be to secure her family's peace, to silence the whispers. But to accept would also be to bind herself to a man who stirred no emotion in her heart. She closed her eyes, pressing the letter against her chest, torn between obedience and the desperate desire for freedom. Lady Eleanor spoke at last, her voice low but steady. She reminded Juliette that choice, though often hidden, always existed, that even under the shadow of duty, one might still claim a fragment of life for oneself. Juliette listened, her heart aching. The thought of defiance both frightened and emboldened her. She longed for escape, yet the chains of expectation bound her tightly. The chamber grew heavy with silence once more. The candlelight flickered, casting restless shadows against the walls. Juliette's eyes drifted toward the window, beyond the drawn curtains, as though she might glimpse some path beyond the confines of her chamber, beyond the suffocating weight of duty. For a moment, she allowed herself to imagine the countryside her aunt had spoken of. The gardens, the quiet air, the freedom from London's cruel gaze. The letter slipped from her lap to the floor, landing softly upon the rug. Juliette stared at it, the wax seal broken, the words still echoing in her mind. Her breath steadied slightly, though her heart remained torn. She lifted her gaze to Lady Eleanor, her lips parting as if to speak, though no words emerged. Her aunt waited patiently, her presence unshaken, her eyes encouraging without command. Juliette rose from the bed, her gown whispering against the floor, and crossed the chamber to the writing desk. She placed her hand upon the letter once more, her fingers lingering on the edge of the paper. She did not know what choice she would make, but she knew that this moment marked the beginning of something different. A step away from despair, though not yet towards certainty. And then, from the courtyard below, the faint sound of carriage wheels reached the chamber, breaking the silence of the night and stilling Juliette where she stood. The sound of wheels upon the stones faded into the night, leaving Juliette standing motionless beside the writing desk. The broken letter lay beneath her hand, its words heavy in her mind, yet the distant echo of the carriage stirred her with an unease she could not name. Lady Eleanor, steady as ever, rested a hand upon her niece's shoulder, urging her to rest. At length, Juliette obeyed, retreating into the stillness of her bed, though sleep came only in fragments, interrupted by restless thoughts and the memory of humiliation. The following morning passed in a haze of quiet resolve. The household stirred cautiously, its servants subdued, its atmosphere heavy with the unspoken scandal. Juliette, determined to endure, descended to breakfast with her aunt, her parents already engaged in hushed discussion elsewhere. No mention was made of the letter, though its presence lingered between them. Lady Eleanor remained close, offering not words but steadiness, her company a quiet shield against despair. It was not long before a decision was reached. By the week's end, Juliette and her aunt departed London for the countryside, the carriage bearing them away from Grosvenor Square and the restless gaze of the city. The road stretched before them, lined with fields touched by the pale green of spring. Each mile carried Juliette further from the echoes of laughter beneath chandeliers, though not yet from the memory of them. She leaned against the window, watching hedgerows and distant cottages slip past, breathing the calmer air beyond the city's reach. The estate that welcomed them was no grand seat of nobility, but a place of quiet charm. Its gardens bloomed with lavender and roses, their fragrance soft in the mild air. Stone walls, weathered with time, enclosed paths shaded by ancient trees. Here, away from London, silence did not oppress but comforted. Lady Eleanor guided Juliette through the grounds upon their arrival, her step unhurried, her voice gentle, pointing out corners where one might sit in solitude, or walk in thought, or breathe freely beneath the open sky. The days that followed unfolded with a rhythm Juliette had not known in years. She woke to the sound of birdsong rather than carriages rattling over cobblestones. She walked among meadows where the grass brushed against her gown, the scent of earth mingling with the sweetness of wildflowers. In the evenings, she sat by the fireside with her aunt, the crackle of flames their only accompaniment, as she read or listened to the steady cadence of Eleanor's reflections. The sharpness of her grief softened, though it did not vanish. Lord Pembroke arrived one afternoon, his carriage rolling along the gravel drive with punctual dignity. He was, as Juliette remembered, polite, measured, his compliments precise and correct. He inquired after her health, praised the serenity of the countryside, and spoke of his admiration for her composure. His attentions were respectable, his presence steady, yet his gaze carried no warmth to stir her heart. Juliette received him with civility, her demeanor gracious, though within she felt only distance. He returned again, each visit reinforcing the nature of his intentions. He offered safety, the restoration of her family's dignity, and a shield against further whispers. His conversation, though earnest, fell flat against the hollowness within her. Each polite exchange reminded her of the path her father wished her to take. the path that led to stability but not to joy. She smiled, she listened, she answered, yet her spirit remained untouched. Unknown to Juliette, her presence in the countryside had not gone unnoticed. Word of her withdrawal spread quietly, reaching even the ears of the Duke of Ravenscroft. Though he made no move at once, the knowledge lingered with him, unsettling his nights, intruding upon his thoughts. He could not erase the image of her wounded face in the ballroom, nor the strength she had shown in her retreat. In his solitude, by the fire of his own manor, he wrestled with emotions he refused to name, yet could not deny. It was at a modest gathering in the village that Juliette's solitude fractured. The assembly room was lit with modest chandeliers, the air filled with the sound of fiddles and laughter. Lady Eleanor persuaded her to attend, reminding her that life required more than sorrow. Juliette entered with composed grace, her gown of ivory silk gleaming beneath the candlelight. Lord Pembroke accompanied her, attentive and watchful, though his presence weighed upon her rather than lifted. The evening unfolded in warmth and simplicity, far from the grandeur of London. Couples danced, neighbors conversed, and the air carried the scent of polished wood and fresh flowers. Juliette felt for a time a gentler ease, her composure steady, her smile unforced. Yet the atmosphere shifted as the doors opened and a figure entered whose presence silenced even the fiddlers. The Duke of Ravenscroft stood upon the threshold, tall and severe, his gaze sweeping the room until it found her. The music faltered, conversation stilled. Guests turned in hushed astonishment, their eyes darting between the Duke and the young woman he had so publicly spurned. Juliette's heart pounded, yet she forced herself to remain still, her chin high, her expression composed. Every eye waited for her collapse, her humiliation renewed. Instead, she stepped forward with measured calm, offering the Duke a curtsy as if nothing bound them but courtesy. Her poise unsettled him. For a brief instant, the mask of his pride cracked, and something unspoken flickered across his face. He bowed in return, his movements deliberate, his eyes lingering upon her longer than custom allowed. Around them, whispers surged like a restless tide. Lord Pembroke stiffened at her side, his gaze wary, his posture protective. The villagers watched with wide eyes, their small assembly transformed into the stage for a greater drama than any they had expected. The silence deepened. The fiddlers lowered their bows. The Duke remained before her, his hand slowly extending, a gesture of unspoken challenge and unyielding intent. The Duke's hand hovered in the space between them, steady, pale against the glow of the chandeliers. For a moment, the entire assembly seemed to lean forward, suspended between silence and revelation. Juliette felt the weight of every gaze pressing against her, the murmur of her own breath loud in her ears. Lord Pembroke shifted beside her, his lips parting as though to object, but he, too, was silenced by the gravity of the gesture. Juliette's heart thudded violently within her chest. She had not expected this, not here, not in the modest room filled with neighbors rather than nobles. Yet, she could not falter. With deliberate calm, she placed her gloved hand in the Duke's. The crowd gasped as the fiddlers lifted their bows once more, though the tune they played was hesitant, fractured by the astonishment of the room. He led her to the center of the floor, his touch firm yet trembling beneath its composure. They turned to face one another as the first notes filled the air, and together they began to move. Their steps were precise, restrained by custom, yet each touch of his hand against hers sent a tremor through her. Around them, the villagers whispered furiously, their eyes wide with disbelief. Juliette kept her chin high, her expression serene, though within she burned with a storm of confusion and unspoken memory. Lord Pembroke watched from the edge of the room, his posture rigid, his jaw set. His eyes followed Juliette with a mixture of protectiveness and alarm, for he could not ignore the undercurrent between her and the Duke. Others, too, studied them with suspicion, wondering what compelled the Duke to travel from London only to stand once more before the woman he had so publicly rejected. The music quickened, and with it the intensity of the whispers. Juliette felt the weight of scandal already taking shape in the minds of the guests. She knew that by tomorrow the tale would travel beyond the village, twisting and growing with every repetition. Yet even as the shadow of gossip gathered, she found strength in her composure. She no longer trembled before the crowd. Her humiliation at the Marlborough ball had burned away her innocence. What remained was steadier, more resilient. When the dance ended, the silence that followed was more deafening than the music. The Duke bowed low before her, his face grave, his eyes fixed upon hers with an intensity that unsettled her composure. He released her hand slowly, as though reluctant to let it go. Then he stepped back, his gaze still lingering as the crowd erupted into murmurs once again. Juliette inclined her head in acknowledgement, her movements measured and precise. She turned away from him without faltering, returning to her aunt's side with dignity intact. Lord Pembroke approached swiftly, offering his arm, his expression taut with suppressed words. She accepted his escort, though her thoughts remained tangled, her heart unsettled. The evening concluded in unease. The guests dispersed in hurried groups, eager to carry news of what they had witnessed. The fiddlers packed away their instruments in silence, their eyes darting between one another as though uncertain of what storm they had played witness to. Lady Eleanor guided Juliette firmly from the room, her presence once more a shield. Lord Pembroke followed, his step heavy, his expression stormy. In the carriage that bore them home, silence reigned. Pembroke sat rigidly across from Juliette, his hands clasped tightly upon his knee. His eyes, when they met hers, carried questions he did not voice. Lady Eleanor remained between them, her gaze fixed upon the passing dark outside the window. Juliette sat still, her gloves folded in her lap, her mind replaying the dance in relentless fragments. The Duke's hand, the crack in his composure, the intensity of his gaze. When they reached the estate, Pembroke bid them good night with stiff formality. His bow to Juliette was deeper than custom demanded, though his face betrayed a turmoil he did not conceal. She curtsied in return, offering him only the courtesy required. He departed, his carriage wheels grinding against the gravel with the sound of restrained anger. Within the house, Juliette lingered in the hall, her pulse still racing. The servants moved quietly, avoiding her eyes, though she knew they too had heard of what transpired at the assembly. Lady Eleanor touched her arm gently, guiding her toward the stairs without a word. The silence between them was not empty. It was filled with the gravity of all that had passed. That night, Juliette lay awake long after the household had surrendered to sleep. The image of the Duke remained before her eyes, his hand extended, his face unguarded, his bow at the end of the dance. She pressed her hands together against her chest, her breath shallow with the memory. She could not name what she had seen in his eyes, nor what it stirred within her, but she knew that nothing was as it had been before. In the days that followed, the consequences unfolded swiftly. Rumors traveled through the village, swelling with each telling. By the week's end, whispers had returned to London. The Duke had danced with Lady Juliette, the very woman he had once rejected. Some said she had pursued him, others that he had chased her into exile. The truth mattered little. The scandal was irresistible. Lord Pembroke became more insistent in his attentions. He visited often, his conversation firm with the language of duty and honor. He spoke of protection, of stability, of shielding her from the cruelties of society. His words were not unkind, yet they pressed against her spirit like a tightening snare. She felt the weight of expectation in every glance, in every carefully measured phrase. Meanwhile, the Duke lingered near. Though he made no open declarations, his presence was felt. Juliette saw him at a distance, on horseback near the village, in the churchyard at Sunday service, on the road as her carriage passed. Each time, his eyes sought hers, steady, searching, filled with a torment he could not conceal. She turned away with dignity, yet within her heart she trembled. Society's judgment grew louder. Letters arrived from London, filled with veiled warnings and sharp reproach. Her parents wrote of the family's peril, urging her to accept Pembroke's hand without delay. The Dowager Duchess, too, sent word, her tone sharp with disapproval, warning her son of disgrace should he persist in his course. Juliette read these words in silence, her heart heavy with the weight of others' demands. Yet through the press of duty and the murmur of scandal, she felt something stir within her, something that would not be silenced. The memory of the dance lingered, not as a humiliation, but as a defiance, a moment where she had stood unbroken before the man who had once shattered her. The whispers of society could not erase the truth she had seen, the crack in his pride, the tremor in his hand, the unguarded flicker in his eyes. But scandal was not patient, nor was duty forgiving. Lord Pembroke pressed her once more, his tone more insistent, his gaze more demanding. Her family's letters grew sharper, their urgency greater, and all the while the Duke's presence loomed closer, his torment deepening, his restraint unraveling. At last, word arrived of another grand ball in London, an event certain to draw every noble eye, certain to revive every whisper. Lady Eleanor spoke of it in quiet tones, warning of the storm it might bring. Juliette listened, her heart pounding, knowing that the stage was being set once more, and that she would soon stand again before both the crowd and the Duke. And as the night of the ball drew near, the weight of scandal pressed heavier, the chains of duty tighter, until the air itself seemed to tremble with the promise of a reckoning soon to come. The grand ball in London unfolded with splendor, its chandeliers blazing as if determined to outshine the whispers that filled the air. The vast hall, lined with gilt mirrors and marble columns, swelled with the finest of society, every guest dressed in silks and jewels that glittered beneath the countless candles. Musicians played with precision, though their music seemed only to underscore the charged anticipation that had settled over the gathering. Lady Juliette entered at her aunt's side, her gown simple compared to the excess of the evening, yet its cream silk and modest pearl adornments gave her a radiance that drew every gaze. The hush that spread at her arrival was unmistakable. She had been humiliated once in such a hall. She had been whispered about, mocked, and dismissed. Yet here she was again, her chin lifted, her step measured, her composure unbroken. The courage of her presence unsettled the crowd even before she spoke a word. Lord Pembroke walked beside her, his posture stiff with determination. His arm was offered, and Juliette rested her hand lightly upon it, though her eyes did not seek his. He bore her toward the throng of nobles who watched intently, some with pity, others with the keen delight of those hungry for scandal. A murmur rose like the rustle of wind through trees, growing louder as more faces turned to follow their progress across the hall. Then the room shifted. The double doors opened, and the Duke of Ravenscroft entered. The atmosphere hardened into silence, broken only by the faint gasp of a lady near the musicians. He strode with unyielding purpose, his dark velvet coat catching the light, his pale face more severe than ever. His presence drew every eye, his reputation commanding attention even before his expression revealed the storm within him. The crowd seemed to part instinctively, allowing him passage, though no one moved without first casting a glance toward Juliette. They all understood the unspoken drama that had gripped London for weeks, the rejection, the retreat, the rumors of meetings in the countryside. Now, at last, both stood in the same hall once more, and society leaned in to witness the collision. Juliette's breath quickened. She did not falter, though her hand tightened briefly upon Pembroke's arm. The Duke's gaze found her, steady and relentless, cutting through the sea of glittering faces as if no one else existed. His steps did not waver. He crossed the floor directly to her, his figure tall, his composure strained but unbroken. The musicians stumbled, their bows faltering as silence fell anew. Lords and ladies stilled, their whispers dying into expectant hush. Juliette felt her pulse hammer in her throat, yet she forced herself to remain calm, her face serene, her eyes lifted. She had stood in this place once before, shattered by his cruelty. Tonight, she vowed she would not break. The Duke reached her. He bowed deeply, his voice low but clear enough to carry through the hush. "My lady," he said, and then faltered. His hand trembled as he extended it toward hers. The pause was unmistakable. Nobles craned their necks, their fans stilled in mid-air. He was a man long known for unyielding pride, yet now his composure quivered before them all. Juliette placed her hand in his, her touch steady though her heart thundered. His grip was firm, yet shook faintly, betraying the torment that burned beneath his control. He raised her hand slowly, deliberately, until it hovered near his lips. The hall held its breath. No one moved, no one spoke. And then, before the eyes of the same court that had once witnessed her humiliation, the Duke of Ravenscroft bowed his head and pressed his lips to Juliette's hand. The gesture was reverent, desperate, unguarded. When he lifted his face again, tears glistened in his eyes, though his jaw remained set. A collective gasp shuddered through the crowd. Fans snapped shut. Some ladies exchanged shocked looks. Some men muttered of impropriety. The Dowager Duchess, seated at the far end of the hall, stiffened visibly, her face a mask of outrage. Lord Pembroke's shoulders tightened, his expression frozen in a mix of anger and disbelief. Juliette stood motionless, her hand still trembling in the Duke's grasp. The scandal of his act was undeniable. He had crossed the boundary of pride and propriety in one gesture, and the hall itself seemed to reel with the enormity of it. The silence, heavy and breathless, bore down upon them both. For a single heartbeat, the world held still, suspended between triumph and ruin, between freedom and disaster. The silence after the Duke's gesture lingered, as if the very walls of the ballroom struggled to absorb what had just occurred. Every guest seemed caught between disbelief and fascination. Then, as though a dam had broken, voices rose in sharp, hurried whispers. Fans fluttered furiously, canes tapped against the polished floor, and the hall trembled with the sound of scandal being born. The Dowager Duchess rose to her feet, her figure stiff, her eyes blazing with fury. She did not call out, but her disapproval radiated from her like a storm. Those nearest to her recoiled instinctively, sensing the wrath of a woman whose will had long dominated her family. A nobleman at her side leaned in, whispering urgently, but she did not sit. Her gaze remained fixed upon her son, her lips pressed into a line of steel. Lord Pembroke released Juliette's arm and stepped back, his posture rigid. His face betrayed the conflict raging within him, humiliation, wounded pride, and the sting of being overshadowed so openly. He bowed stiffly, more to contain his own anger than to show respect, and turned away. Without a word, he crossed the floor, disappearing into the crowd, leaving Juliette standing before the Duke in full view of society's scrutiny. Juliette did not move. Her hand trembled faintly in the Duke's grasp, but her eyes remained steady. She saw the torment in his face, the vulnerability he had struggled so long to conceal. For the first time, the cold mask he had worn in every past encounter was gone. Before her stood not the untouchable Duke of Ravenscroft, but a man undone by the truth of his own heart. Around them, the whispers sharpened. "Disgraceful," hissed one lady, snapping her fan shut. "Madness," muttered a gentleman, tugging at his cravat. Yet not all voices condemned. Some murmured of bravery, of passion breaking through the chains of duty. The assembly was divided, scandal spilling into every corner, yet Juliette heard none of it clearly. Her focus remained fixed upon the man before her, his tears still glistening beneath the light of the chandeliers. The musicians, uncertain, had lowered their bows and waited in silence. The dancers who had once filled the floor stood frozen, their gowns and coats a tableau of astonishment. Servants at the edge of the hall held their trays motionless, their eyes wide, knowing the tale they would carry beyond these walls would outlive the night. The Duke did not release her hand. His breath came unevenly, but his posture was firm, as though he had resolved that no force of society, not even his mother's fury, could undo what he had done. Juliette, her heart racing, realized that in this moment he had chosen her, not in words, but in an act that defied the very rules that bound them both. The Dowager Duchess swept from the hall, her departure as sharp as her presence had been. The rustle of her silks trailed behind her like the crack of a whip, leaving a silence more damning than words. The nobles nearest the doors followed quickly, their curiosity giving way to fear of being caught in the heart of such a storm. Yet others lingered, eager to see the aftermath of a scandal that would dominate every drawing room and parlor in London by morning. Juliette drew her hand back gently, not in rejection, but to steady herself. She inclined her head, acknowledging the Duke's bow with a composure that astonished even herself. Then, turning with quiet dignity, she crossed the floor to where Lady Eleanor stood, her aunt's eyes filled with both pride and concern. The hall parted before her, not with respect, but with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Lady Eleanor took her niece's arm firmly, guiding her toward the antechamber. The Duke remained behind, his figure tall and unyielding amid the sea of startled faces. His declaration had been made, not in words but in an action no one could deny. He had bound his name to hers, and in so doing, had set into motion a tide neither could fully control. The antechamber was cooler, quieter, though the muffled hum of voices from the ballroom carried through the doors. Juliette leaned against a column, her breath shallow, her mind struggling to absorb what had unfolded. Lady Eleanor pressed her hand in reassurance, her expression calm, though the gravity of the moment was plain in her eyes. The ride home was cloaked in silence. The carriage swayed gently over the cobblestones, its lanterns casting fleeting light against the dark streets of London. Juliette sat pressed against the window, her thoughts turbulent. She had expected to endure whispers, to suffer duty, to bear her disgrace quietly. She had not expected the Duke to break before society, to kneel in humility and expose his heart in tears. In the days that followed, the scandal spread with ferocity. Every parlor echoed with the tale, each version embroidered with new exaggerations. Some claimed the Duke had begged at her feet, others that Juliette had forced his hand. Letters arrived from her parents, filled with urgency and alarm, demanding explanations. The Dowager Duchess, through intermediaries, made her disapproval thunderously clear. Yet amid the fury and the gossip, Juliette felt a strange peace. She had seen his torment unveiled, had felt his hand tremble as he pressed his lips to hers. The memory did not wound her as his rejection had. Instead, it steadied her. It told her that she had not been wrong to feel the spark between them, that the cruelty of the past had been armor rather than truth. The Duke defied his mother, setting aside alliances once deemed sacred. Juliette, too, resisted her family's pleas to accept Pembroke. They did not act rashly. They simply refused to bend any longer to the dictates of a society that had mocked and tormented them. Their union would not be grand, nor would it silence the gossips, but it would be chosen freely. Together, they began to prepare for a future that was simpler, smaller, but infinitely truer. The glitter of chandeliers was replaced by the thought of sunlight on gardens, of days lived without masks, of evenings filled not with performance, but with companionship. The storm of scandal had not vanished, nor had society's disapproval waned. But for Juliette and the Duke, its weight no longer crushed. The choice had been made, and though the path ahead would not be free of shadows, it would be theirs to walk together. The summer morning dawned clear, the sky washed with pale light that softened the fields around Lady Eleanor's estate. The chapel that stood upon the grounds, small and ancient, glowed beneath the early sun. Its stone walls were covered in ivy, and its arched windows caught the light in muted colors. The bells rang softly, their chime not thunderous like those of London's great churches, but tender, carrying across the meadows and gardens in a melody that seemed more fitting for a union born not of duty but of choice. Inside, the chapel was filled not with throngs of nobles but with a modest gathering of those who truly wished them well. The wooden pews bore only a few guests, Lady Eleanor, steadfast and proud, a handful of trusted companions from the countryside, and servants who had long been part of Juliette's daily life. Absent were the jeweled crowds, the towering wigs, and the endless parade of curious eyes. What remained was simple and real. Juliette stood at the entrance, her gown of cream muslin flowing lightly around her. The fabric was plain compared to the silk she had once worn, yet it seemed to belong to her more than any finery ever had. Her hair, gathered softly, bore no powder, only the natural dark gloss of its strands, adorned with a crown of wildflowers plucked from the estate's gardens. Her hands trembled, but not from fear. She breathed deeply, her heart rising with every step she prepared to take down the aisle. At the altar, the Duke of Ravenscroft waited. He was dressed with formality, though without the excess that London would have demanded. His dark coat was cut neatly, his cravat simple. Yet his eyes, fixed upon Juliette, were unlike the cold steel they had once been. They were steady, softened by a quiet joy, though a sheen of emotion lingered in them, betraying the weight of the path that had brought him here. The air inside the chapel was hushed, filled with the scent of lilies and roses arranged along the altar. As Juliette began her slow walk down the aisle, the wooden floor creaked beneath her steps, each sound measured and certain. She did not think of the whispers that still swirled in London, nor of the fury of the Dowager Duchess, nor of the alliances abandoned. She thought only of the man who stood waiting, who had once shattered her heart and had since laid bare his own in a gesture that defied the world. When she reached him, he extended his hand. She placed hers into it, and together they turned toward the clergyman. His voice rose in calm authority, reciting the vows that bound them not by arrangement nor by ambition, but by the promise of affection chosen freely. Juliette's voice trembled as she spoke her vows, but her eyes never wavered from the Duke's. When it was his turn, his voice faltered only once, breaking slightly as he swore his devotion. When the words were spoken and the blessing given, he drew her hand to his lips once more. This time, there were no chandeliers, no court to witness with scorn or delight. There were only the few who loved them, the gentle light through the chapel windows, and the quiet dignity of a promise kept. He kissed her hand with reverence, then lifted her face and pressed his lips softly against hers. The kiss was tender, unhurried, filled with the weight of all that had been endured and the hope of what lay ahead. The chapel filled with warmth as the small gathering rose in quiet joy. Lady Eleanor's eyes glistened, her composure steady, but her pride unmistakable. The servants smiled openly, no longer needing to conceal their emotions behind lowered gazes. The bells outside rang once more, their chime brighter now, carrying into the air like an anthem of freedom. The couple emerged from the chapel into the sunlight. The gardens stretched before them, filled with the fragrance of summer. The fields rolled into the distance, untamed by the rigid order of London squares. Children from the village, curious and eager, gathered at the gates, scattering petals as they passed. The simplicity of it moved Juliette more than any procession of carriages ever could. Hand in hand, they walked across the grass, their steps unhurried, their faces lifted toward the open sky. Juliette felt a lightness in her chest she had not known since before the Marlborough Ball. The memory of her humiliation no longer bound her. It had been transformed into the path that had led her here, to this moment of liberation. They paused by the old oak that shaded the edge of the gardens. The Duke turned to her, his face softened, his eyes unguarded. He spoke not with the commanding tone of a nobleman, but with the voice of a man humbled by love. He told her that his past pride, his harshness, had been born of wounds he had carried, but that no shadow could endure in her presence. Juliette listened, her eyes shining, and answered with quiet certainty that she did not need a duke's perfection, only a man's truth. Their foreheads touched, their hands clasped, and for a long moment they stood in silence, hearing only the breeze through the leaves and the distant chime of the bells. The world around them faded into peace, the clamor of society far behind, the judgment of others powerless against the strength of what they had chosen. Later, as the modest feast was laid out beneath the garden's shade, laughter replaced silence. The air was filled not with the strained courtesies of London banquets, but with genuine warmth. Servants and guests mingled without division, united by affection for the couple. The Duke, once so distant, bent to listen to every word Juliette spoke, his hand never far from hers. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, casting golden light across the fields, Juliette and Armand walked once more among the roses. The day's quiet joy settled around them like a mantle, and with it came a profound stillness of the heart. The long journey from humiliation to love had left its scars, but it had also carved a path of strength and authenticity neither would ever forget. And so their story, born in pain, closed in peace. From the grandeur of chandeliers to the simplicity of a garden, they had discovered that true happiness lay not in society's approval, but in the courage to follow one's heart. The world beyond the estate would continue to whisper, to judge, to bind others in chains of duty. But within the circle of their union, those chains no longer reached. Dear listener, may their story remind us all that pride may falter, duty may wound, and voices may condemn. Yet love chosen freely can redeem even the deepest humiliation. To follow the truth of one's heart is to find a freedom greater than any title, a joy brighter than any chandelier, a peace stronger than any storm. Thank you so much for listening to this story all the way to the end. We hope it moved you as much as it moved us while telling it. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave us a comment telling us where you're listening from and what you liked the most. Rate this story from 0 to 10. What score would you give it? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like as a show of support. That really motivates us to keep creating and sharing more stories full of emotion and life lessons. And before we go, we want to remind you that an exciting and heartwarming story recommendation will appear on the final screen. If you'd like to enjoy it, just click on the video. Thank you once again for being here, and we'll see you in the next story.